There's approximately 1 billion atheists on this planet now. We used to think it was a minority position, but it's considered the 5th biggest religion in the world. You have, for instance, in Britain, the fastest growing religion is atheism. So the point here is, brothers and sisters, this is a force to be reckoned with. And obviously, we should not deal with this force in a discourse that you can describe as debating.
My question is, did you see that, wait, these guys know something about Islam?
Yeah.
And I don't want to put myself in that situation where I'm being humiliated or being interrogated or being whatever it may be. But it shows you really that your ideas are so superficial, you're not ready to be probed on them, right?
You don't have to prove anything. This is your natural belief. This is a self-evident truth. So the question is, not does God exist? The question should be, what reasons do you have to reject God? That's the question. But we get so fooled because we don't understand our epistemology, our ontology. We don't understand our usul. Because we think, oh no, we have to prove everything. We don't. The onus of proof is on them.
So I have these active beliefs that determine how I live my life day to day, that go even beyond my death. But your goal should be to reverse the burden of proof. Because I'm tired. I'm speaking for the Christian. I'm tired of always having to defend it. Why don't you stinking atheists defend your worldview for once? This is going to bother Christians listening, but I'm going to speak to atheists right now. Atheists, when you're interacting with Christians, don't make any claims at all. This will bother them. They so badly want you to say something and claim it. And if you do claim something, you say, well, claims are a dime a dozen. Like there's many people who claim to be God himself. There's people alive today who claim to be God. A bunch of humans wrote the Quran, and it has nothing to do with God. It's more likely than a deity doing it.
The existence of God is something called an axiomatic belief. What is an axiomatic belief? An axiomatic belief, brothers and sisters, is a self-evident truth. Let me give you an example of a self-evident truth. Can you hear this? What is this? It's a lectern. It's a podium. All right. Now, prove to me this podium is real. It's no proof. He said you could see it, you can touch it, feel it, right? But is that proof? It's not proof. So the point is, this is called a self-evident truth. So the real world being the real world is an axiom. It's a self-evident truth that requires no proof. This is why Allah is not a concept, He is a precept. He is that which is necessary to have all ideas and concepts and realities. So, if you reject Allah, and I'm going to end on this, it's equivalent of rejecting the real world as the real world.
The object of a Christian's faith has to be the revelation of God in the person of Jesus Christ, resurrected and present and available in the lives of Christians right now. That revelation is directly accessible to us. We don't have to look at ancient history to go dig this up or, try to find evidence that Jesus is alive. For the same reasons, I don't have to find evidence that I don't have to go look at birth records to find out evidence that my husband's alive. I can talk to him and interact with him. And Jesus is the same way, right?
Jesus is the same way as your husband? Of course not. Unless you can actually touch Jesus, like you can touch a coffee cup, because you can touch your husband, unless you can audibly hear Jesus like you can audibly hear your husband. When your husband farts, you can smell it. Can you smell Jesus's farts?
Maybe your brain is on Mars in a vat with probes, and an alien is making you feel what you're feeling now and thinking what you're thinking now. Right? That could be the case. Maybe you didn't take the blue pill. Maybe you're in the Matrix. And that's why Bertrand Russell, the grandfather of atheism, he basically said that you cannot deny the assertion that maybe the universe was created 3 minutes ago. Because maybe it was created 3 minutes ago, and you were created with all of these memories that you've existed for the past 40 years. The basis of science and materialism and empiricism is that the real world is the real world, but they can't really prove it. Go to the philosophy of science. We need it as a self-evident axiom, an axiomatic truth, which the whole theories and the philosophies emanate from. Just like us, God is a self-evident truth that requires no justification.
Even if we can't be sure that, quote, reality is real, or is what we think we're experiencing, it still interacts with us like reality, right? I mean, it still seems very real, and we still have to deal with the idea that there are things in, like right now I've got my glasses, right, and I'm holding my glasses up on the screen, and for me, these glasses, whether my reality is real or not, my mind has a model of these glasses that are in my hands. What it doesn't have is alien spaceships hovering above the studio. I walk outside right now, I don't see alien spaceships hovering above the studio. And if Don were to tell me that there are alien spaceships hovering above the studio and I go out and look and I don't see them, now we have a problem because Don and I agree that our minds are producing a model of the glasses, but Don is saying there's alien spaceships and I'm not getting that data. So even if solipsism, even if we're working from the idea that it's all just your mind, the reality is even in that, there are things that are and things that are not modeled by my brain and my mind. So we still have a discrepancy when someone comes in and says, there's a God in there. It's like, where? What level? You know, where does this God come in? Because I haven't come across it. One of them is saying, this is what I'm confronted with. The other one is saying, I believe in things I'm not confronted with. And that is two different statements that are hugely, vastly different, right? I mean, one person is basically saying, I'm confronted with the glasses. I don't know if they're real or not. The other person is saying, I'm not even confronted with this thing that I believe in, and I just believe that it's real, regardless of no confrontation with it.
When you think of Allah's name, the truth, that essentially is that which requires no evidence because it is already self-evident. Now, someone may say, okay, this is interesting. So if I deny God, it's like denying the real world is the real world because they're both axioms. They might say, what about the great pumpkin? I believe the great pumpkin created the universe. Can I consider that an axiom? Maybe I believe in the great fairy at the bottom of my garden. She created the universe. That could be a self-evident truth. There's a subtlety here. Self-evident truths are only valid if they don't require information transfer. As we understood, the concept of supernatural causal agency doesn't require information transfer. If I threw you on a desert island, you would conclude that yourself. But for me to know what a great pumpkin is and what a fairy is, I need some knowledge of mythology or legends or some type of understanding of English culture.
The word God itself does not carry any proper meaning, any defined meaning. It's rather an idea that emerged and was shaped over time by people in different ways. We are only talking about the existence of God because we are in a culture and a time where that is important, where believing in God is the norm, where it's relevant. In a different time or place, the question, does God exist, wouldn't even matter. People would wonder why we are talking about this. Even when we are talking about the one God, who is the creator, the shape, the nature, the purpose of this God has changed from time to time and is different between different religions. It changes from Judaism to Christianity, it changes from Christianity to Islam massively. In Hinduism, the creator God is a completely different being and doesn't carry the same importance or the same attention. In many East Asian religions, God is not a person, but rather just a force. In Buddhism, there is no eternal creator. But hey, let's put the divide between Christianity and Islam and Christians and Muslims aside. Let's say that monotheism is true. Let's talk about China. What about the guy in China? In China, it doesn't even matter whether you believe in God or not. The question is completely irrelevant. It wouldn't make sense for an average Chinese person to sit here and to explain to the Chinese people why he doesn't believe in God. Because nobody believes in God. People would just sit and be like, why are you telling us this? Most people in China don't believe in God. The question doesn't mean anything to them. And this is not an active act of disbelief, of disbelieving. No, the question is unfamiliar to them.
The other contention is, wait a minute, wasn't the world being flat a self-evident truth? They just saw the world and they said, that's it, it's flat. Isn't that a self-evident truth? Very interesting contention.
What's more crazy, believing the earth is flat or believing a man ascended into heaven? At least you can kind of feel for the flat earthers because when they walk outside, they go, it looks flat. I walk down the street. I don't see people on horses or winged beasts flying into the heavens. I've never seen that. Okay. And I think I could poll all my neighbors in my neighborhood and ask them if they've ever seen that. And they would say, no, I've never seen that.
Yeah.
And you can believe a God exists and still say,
that God seems like it has the proclivity, the inclination not to do stuff like that very often, or if at all. And what it really boils down to is something very, very simple. What's more likely? That Muhammad actually did get on a winged beast and fly into the heavens, or a book just says that happened and maybe it never did? To me, it seems way more likely that a book just said so and it never did happen in the past.
This is how you answer it. That's true. Self-evident truths can change if there's future evidence to deny them, or there's evidence that we find to deny them. Where is the evidence to deny God? The only evidence people claim is scientific evidence. But if you study the philosophy of science, science only deals with empirical realities. Is God an empirical reality? Laysa kamithlihi shay. He's outside of the physical universe. So science, as a domain of thought and a methodology, is de-scoped because you can't get God and put him into a test tube and test him, right? So from this perspective, no matter what future empirical scientific evidence comes, it can never ever deny God's existence, because it can only talk about how things work, not why things work, and deal with the things that they could touch and feel. God is outside of that domain. So that contention can never exist against God, because science can never ever reject God's existence. Any sincere scientist will say this to you.
What do we mean when we ask the question, can science disprove God? After all, one could argue that science doesn't disprove anything, ever. So if my opponent begins to demand absolute certainty with respect to anything, but especially this unscientific notion of disproof, he's setting a bar that virtually no scientist or philosopher would ever support, and it's merely a tactic to avoid the undeniable fact that science deals in probabilities and leads to tentative conclusions that best fit the evidence. So if science doesn't actually disprove anything, then we're done, right? Well, not quite. Because what we tend to mean colloquially when we talk about proof and disproof, and when we speak about science disproving a proposition, is actually just a statement that the proposition is ill-defined, is untestable, lacks good supporting evidence, or even has some evidence against it. Because it's entirely possible to logically disprove a God whose definition entails either an internal contradiction or one whose definition conflicts with observations about the universe. If either of those cases is true, then that God has been disproved in about the only possible sense. I'd suspect that my opponent agrees with this point, because there are many, many gods that he clearly doesn't believe in, which means he's ruled those other gods to be fictions and determined that his is fact. But how did those proposed gods lose their followers? They were defined in such a way that it simply became unreasonable to continue believing in them in the face of better scientific explanations for the universe that seemed to conflict with what those God propositions had to say about the universe.
No matter what you read, now you know that you should have intellectual tranquility, that at the end of the day, it's not about who does God exist. It's about what reasons do you have to reject God's existence, and usually they're not intellectual, they're emotional.
My opponent may have some God that he defines, which science can't disprove, under very narrow and unscientific definitions of science and disprove. There are other gods that one could define which science could also not disprove under those conditions. And that means that mere disproof by science is irrelevant. My opponent must have some other way to distinguish between the various gods that science can't disprove, or else he's guilty of special pleading. If there are 12 God propositions that can't be disproved by science, and he's managed to pick one of them while rejecting the other one, that's either a fallacy of special pleading, or he has some reliable mechanism by which he's able to discern which of them is fact and which is fiction. And that needs to be presented.
Usually they're not intellectual, they're emotional.
Like 90% of the Quran is emotional, spiritual, 10% is intellectual.